good to be with all of you today. Our first Sunday forum of this new program year. I am particularly excited about today's guest. And I don't know if you remember this or not, but my very first week on campus, at the Luther Seminary, Anna was the volunteer group leader for my orientation group. What was that? First week, I think is what they called it, right? Yeah. I don't know that they do it the same way and all, but now, since I got to know Anna that week in 2008, wow. Anna's gone off and become Dr. Anna Marsh, and has been recently added to the faculty at Luther Seminary, which is such a delight, which gives me confidence that the seminary is continuing to make the right decisions. And so we give thanks this day that Dr. Marsh has joined us. We are in this story that we are re-embracing and re-entering again this fall. The narrative lectionary really hones in on and lifts up this theological concept of covenant and promise. And so we've asked Dr. Marsh to come today and help set the stage for us for the year ahead in some extent, but particularly as we look at the Old Testament. What's really at stake with this question of covenant and promise? Now, Anna, new to the seminary, but she is obviously a graduate of Luther Seminary, and your PhD you received from, I'm going to get it wrong, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and so what a delight to be able to bring that scholarship to bear for us this day. Anna, for in the time since seminary, since Luther, since I got to know her there, and while she was engaged in her studies at Jewish Theological Seminary, she also worked in the bishop's office, and so we crossed paths a lot with Anna, as she was the assistant to the bishop, a special assistant to the bishop. I'm going to give you that title, special assistant. Really kept the bishop on track and kept things moving for us as a synod in many, many ways. And now she's bringing all of her gifts and resources to bear on her teaching at the seminary. What are you teaching this fall?
Here.
There you go.
Yeah, now we don't have to shout. I'm teaching Hebrew, and I'm teaching prophets and poetry, which is like their second half of the Bible intro class.
Awesome, awesome. Well, please help me welcome Dr. Anna Marsh.
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you all. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I remember actually meeting your pastor in his first week of seminary and thinking, this is a good one. So today we are going to talk about covenant. Could we have the slides turned on here? So I'm gonna, and I can see it right there. That's perfect. So great. All right. So we're going to talk about how the Bible, especially the Hebrew Bible, talks about this concept of covenant. I think it might be a word that you hear in church a lot, right? But I wonder how often we think about what that means and why it is used so much in the Bible. So here is our roadmap for the morning. We're going to talk about, in just a moment, we're going to talk about two kinds of covenants that make up most of the Hebrew Bible's theological concept of covenant. We're going to talk about two historical turning points in the history of ancient Israel, and then we're going to talk about, or I'm going to give you 3 pieces of background information. So first, actually, we're going to start with the background information. 1, the books of the Bible were written by many different authors in a variety of historical contexts. This means that they were concerned with different things when they were writing. 2, all of the books of the Bible were written against the backdrop of empire. So whether it's the Egyptians or the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Persians or the Romans, There's always an empire in the background. There's very little time throughout the span of biblical history, which is almost 2,000 years from the Hebrew Bible through the New Testament, when the kingdoms of Israel and Judah were self-governing. They were almost always a tiny nation trying to survive under huge empires. We're going to focus mainly today on the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, not only because that's my area, but also because it's where we get the concept of covenant that then the New Testament takes up when to talk about the events that surrounded the life and death of Jesus. So, your third piece of background information. Oh, here are all of the empires. It's a map of all of the empires. So, 3, the biblical authors did not invent, but rather borrowed the concept of covenant from their wider cultural context. So we will come back to all of these things over the course of the morning, and you can feel free to ask questions at another time. So first, let's talk about just what is covenant. What do you think of when you hear that word? Contract. Good. What else do you think of? Promise. Agreement. Anything else? Oh, okay, like a mutual responsibility. Right. Yep. There was one over here I heard. Relationship. Good. I think you got all of my major ideas there. So promise, hope, testament is another way to. It's another word that becomes the word for testament. Agreement and relationship. Good. So here is a definition by. This is by a biblical scholar named George Mendenhall. He's done a lot of work on the concept of covenant. He says it's an agreement enacted by two parties in which one or both make promises under oath to perform or refrain from certain actions stipulated in advance. Okay. So, agreement between parties, promises, and then some stipulations. There are some things that are required of you, right, in a covenant relationship. So, right, technically we have this agreement and it's a formal arrangement, and I think we can even say that it is a legally binding contract in some ways. What is interesting about this is that this is the most common metaphor that the Hebrew Bible uses for the relationship between God and humanity, is this formal arrangement with certain things expected, with the stipulations laid out in advance. It's the most common metaphor for how God and humans are connected. And it is a personal and a political metaphor. Okay, so earlier I said that the authors of the Bible borrowed the concept of covenant. We know this because of how covenant is presented in the Bible. We have documents from ancient Israel's neighbors that follow certain patterns, political documents that follow certain patterns. And the biblical texts about covenant follow those patterns almost to a T. They're agreements between parties, and in the wider context, it's a political agreement between a more powerful king and a less powerful king. That's usually what these documents are reflecting. I say they follow it almost to a T because there is one important difference in the biblical covenants. In the biblical covenants, who is the more important party, the more powerful party? God, exactly. So they are taking this model of political relationship in the context of empire and saying, yeah, we are also in this kind of relationship, but the more powerful king that we are in relationship with is the God of the cosmos, right? And so it is in some way a way of telling these powerful empires that your power does not control, like your power is, we respond to a different power. So it's a model of resistance as well as a way of mirroring these kinds of documents. So one thing that is, and so you can see here on the slide, these are the elements of these political documents. So all of these political documents have these elements. It identifies who's giving the covenant. It gives a history of things they have done that have made them powerful and important. It lists what is required of each party. It talks about where the covenant will be deposited. It gives a list of the people who have witnessed it. And it gives a list of blessings and curses, either for following the agreement or for breaking the agreement. So, one thing that is not listed here, actually, but was a feature of Israelite covenants and the ones that they were patterned after, is a ratification ceremony, which is the ceremony that seals the agreement, right? It's usually a ceremony that involves the sacrifice and a meal. And just for now, just hold on to that, because we're going to come back to it. So, I want to, well, you can see here, this is the, so this is how these elements of the covenant end up in the biblical language. So we have all of those same elements, right? The identification of the covenant giver and a history of their deeds. In biblical language, that becomes, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt and the house of bondage. The stipulations and the requirements, so what is asked of the people in the covenant agreement, includes all of biblical law. Like the stuff from the first 5 books of the Old Testament, those are the stipulations and the requirements of this covenant relationship. So follow my statutes and keep my commandments and observe them faithfully, right? And it's a lot of laws. Number 4, the next element would be that you deposit the text somewhere. There's a public record of this agreement that is kept somewhere. So that would be, in the biblical example, that would be to put the tablets of the Ark of the Covenant in, or to put the tablets of the covenant in an ark and keep them somewhere. So, list of witnesses. Most often, the biblical texts will call on heaven and earth as the witnesses to this arrangement. So rather than there being human witnesses, there are kind of like cosmic and natural witnesses to the sealing of this relationship. And then a list of blessings and curses. So some of this I present because I think it helps us understand some of the biblical language that is, to our ears, sounds really harsh. So, you know, we know God to be just and loving, right? And then you turn to the pages of the Hebrew Bible and you hear this language about like curses and all of this terrible stuff that can happen, and it just feels kind of, I think it can make the Hebrew Bible feel like foreign to us in a way, or feel like, well, that's not the God we know in Jesus, right? But what is important is that these are part of the model of, like, this is what the biblical writers are borrowing on. It's like, this language is totally standard. It would have been recognized by everybody who was literate at the time, right? They would have known that this is how these documents are supposed to look. And so you have these blessings and curses. If you obey the Lord your God by diligently observing his commandments that I am commanding you today, the Lord your God will set you high above the nations of the earth, and all of the nations will bless you if you obey the Lord your God. But if you will not obey me and you do not observe these commandments, and then there's this long list of things that can go wrong for you. So, let's see if we can get this to go again. Oh. Can you click forward to the next slide? Oh, there we go. Okay, before we move on to the 2 kinds of covenants, I want to I've already used this language of God as a more powerful king. So I just want to take a very quick detour and talk about the metaphors that we use to talk about God. So all of our language for God in the Bible, of course, comes as metaphors. God is father, God is mother, God is king, shepherd, potter, physician, judge, all of these different familiar ways of talking about the way that we understand and experience God, but we also hear them differently because we make different associations with those concepts. So metaphors are based on associations, right? So what do you think when you hear the word king? What do you think when you hear the word father or shepherd or, so the associations that you make with each of those concepts shapes how you hear God being talked about. If you have positive associations with like a physician or a judge, maybe that's an easy association for you to make and say, I understand something about God from that. If you have difficult associations with those, it changes the way that you hear what a biblical text is saying about God, right? Like if you have a difficult relationship with your father, maybe God as father is not comforting language to you. So I'm thinking about this just this week because it's not a metaphor, it's a real person, of course, but Queen Elizabeth died. And she represents a lot of different things to a lot of different people, right? And there have been these reactions to her death that are, she was a mother figure. She was a respected female head of state or a ruler, and there are too few of those, Maybe she's the relic of a bygone era, or maybe she is the figurehead of a brutal and exploitative colonialist regime, right? So all of these things are getting associated with Queen Elizabeth this week, and people's responses to her death are so colored by their associations that they make with, monarchy, right? So, it's, which one of those is the truth, right? It's hard to say. So is God technically a king or a father or a judge or a potter? No, right? These are ways of saying something else about God, of calling on those associations by wrapping language around something that surpasses all categorization. Okay, so when I say that covenant is a personal and political metaphor, is it literally a treaty with God? No. But it is presented that way because the associations that you make with the relationship that Israel has with God, or the associations that Israel made with the relationship they had with God, they found something meaningful in that comparison, right? So to say, like, I want God is my protector. God is trustworthy. I'm making a commitment to this relationship, right? You know what is expected of you, and I think there's some comfort in that. Okay, so I said we were going to talk about two kinds of covenants. This maybe is the part of our morning that gets the most esoteric. So just hang with me here. So two kinds of covenants. We have a covenant in the Hebrew Bible, we see two very clearly different kinds of covenants. One is a covenant of obligation, and one is a covenant of grant. So, can we go to the next slide? All right. The home turfs of each of these kinds of covenants, the home turf of the covenant of obligation is Mount Sinai. The home turf of the covenant of grant is Mount Zion. So, and you can see on the slide here that they are different in really significant ways. In a covenant of obligation, the loyalty really goes up. It goes from the people up to the more powerful party. In the covenant of grant, it goes the other way. With obligation, you are loyal to that ruler because of their protection in the past. And then on the other side, the more powerful party, say God in the biblical covenant, is loyal to David because of David's loyal service in the past, right? So you can kind of see that there are mirror images of one another, I think, in each of these ways. So and then on one side, it depends on being upheld. It can be broken. On this side, it can't be broken. Or can it, right? But probably not. It probably can't be broken. We're going to come back to that. So, on one side, you have a legally binding agreement with penalties for breaking it. And over here, it is also a binding agreement, but the focus is on the more powerful party, and so the assumption is that it will never be broken. So you have Moses and biblical law on one side, and then the covenants with Noah and Abraham and David on the other side. So that means that in the Hebrew Bible, we have at least 4 major covenants that God has made with humanity, right? Okay. So, let's see. I think we can move on. This is the text of God's covenant with Moses. This is recorded in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. So it's really like in the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. And just highlighted in purple here, you can see, again, these elements of covenant language. So, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. If you follow my commandments and keep my statutes and observe them faithfully. But if you do not follow my commandments and observe them. And then it says, surely the passage from Deuteronomy down at the bottom, surely this is not too hard for you, nor is it too far away. No, the word is very near to you. It is in your mouth and in your heart for you to observe. So again, you have all of those same elements of these political documents that are then being used as a model for how Israel is talking about their relationship with God. The covenant with Noah at the end of Genesis, at the end of the flood narrative, is then this covenant is the model of the covenant of grant, or is one example of the covenant of grant. You can see here that God will not, this is the sign of the covenant. It will be with you for all generations, for all, you and all your descendants after you, right? So it's like, it's not based on certain stipulations. It's just going to be there for all time. And then I think here's the covenant with Abraham, which is, again, a model of a covenant of grant. So, not based on stipulations, but based on the relationship that God is making with this human being. So it will last forever. It's an everlasting covenant. Oops. Okay. And then finally, the covenant with David. So I said that the covenant of obligation kind of lives on the home turf is Mount Sinai, and the covenant with Moses. David and Mount Zion are really the home bases of the covenant of grant. Okay. And again, this is going to be everlasting. I will never withdraw my favor from you. It will be secure before you. Your throne will be established forever. So, I think maybe, are there reactions to these 2 different kinds of covenants right now? Do you have questions or comments? Something bothering you? Yes? Can it be voided? That is an excellent question, and we're going to come to that in a moment. Yeah.
What, manifest destiny? Does that have an origin in a covenant like that?
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question for the benefit
Yes. So the question is, what about manifest destiny? Does that have a basis in this kind of language, right? I think yes. I think the way you're talking about, early American, that's what you're talking about, right? Yeah. The way that the people who first came to the Europeans who came to North America, right, definitely had a lot of these texts in their mind, right, in their sense of who they were and what they were doing as they came to North America. Yeah. Okay. Coming back to your question here, let's take another quick detour from our roadmap, which is to talk about how a covenant can be broken, or if a covenant can be broken. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah. So in these kind of arrangements, can somebody be in breach of contract, right? So the first possibility is that the people would break the covenant, right? That they would be in breach of contract. If that is the case, can God sue them for breach of contract? The prophets in the Hebrew Bible say, yeah. And that's exactly what is happening. And they use legal language all the way through the prophetic texts for talking about how this relationship has gone wrong. So you can see here, Hosea says, the Lord has a case against you, right? The Lord rises to argue his case and stands to judge. Jeremiah says, therefore, once more I sue you, says the Lord. So yes, the prophets are arguing that the people have broken the covenant, and therefore they are in breach of contract, right? On the other side, is it possible that God can break the contract, right? And that is, can we go to the next slide? Well, we're going to skip this one. That is, okay. So if God breaks the contract, do the people have any legal recourse to that? And this is what the book of Job is about. Job says, what has happened to me is not fair. This is not what we agreed to, and I would like to sue, but I am really not sure I would win, right? But this is what the book of Job is about. Job is arguing that God is in breach of contract. He also uses this legal language, right? You can see it here highlighted. Man cannot win a suit against God. If it's a trial of strength, like who are going to be my witnesses? I have no chance of winning. And then I think there's a genuine debate about whether or not he actually wins his case. For the record, I happen to think that he does. I happen to think that at the end of the book of Job, God says, yeah, you have spoken rightly of me. You're right, I was in breach of contract. But there is a genuine, there's a genuine discussion among people who study the book of Job about whether or not that's the way that the lawsuit comes out in the end. So, okay. So let's go to our next kind of stop on the roadmap. So 2 historical turning points. So we have these 2 kinds of covenants, right? We have covenants of obligation and covenants of grant. And then we have 2 historical turning points in the history of ancient Israel that really put these ideas to the test. The contrast between these 2 different kinds of covenants and the people who maybe adhere to them or understand their relationship with God in that framework are certainly going to come to, they're going to come to odds with one another. So the contrast between those big ideas, of course, is going to be, these historical turning points matter because it's at these moments of turmoil or chaos when, your ideas really, it's like the rubber meets the road, right? So we're going to take these 2 examples, the Exodus from Egypt and the Babylonian exile. Now, like I said, the span of biblical history in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament is almost 2,000 years. Between these 2 events, we have almost 1,000 years of history. So a lot more happens than these 2 big historical events. So, think about how much happens in just one day in our world, right? I certainly hope that for their sake, life was less chaotic in the ancient world than it feels today, but it certainly was not less uncertain or less violent. And so just picking these 2 moments, or picking 2 moments is sort of hard, but they were, from what we see in the Hebrew Bible, these 2 moments are big ones that reframed Israel's understanding of itself and of God. So these big ideas, I think, are either going to find harmony with one another or they're going to find tension with one another. So, real quickly, maybe these are familiar to you, but I don't want to assume. So, real quickly, in the Exodus event, the Exodus from Egypt, we can kind of locate it in around the 13th century BCE. But basically what happens is that God brings the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt and to serve God, right? To be in a relationship with God instead, but saves them from hundreds of years of oppression and forced labor. And this is a moment of great triumph, right? 800 or so years later, we have the Babylonian exile. So again, a different empire is kind of at play here. But in the Babylonian exile, this is around, it actually takes about a decade, but it culminates in 587 BCE with the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. The temple is destroyed, most of the city is torn down and taken over by the Babylonians. At that time, the religious tradition had come to teach that God had chosen to protect Jerusalem, which is situated traditionally on Mount Zion, right? So you can hear this, maybe this covenant of grant language coming back in, right? That like, this will never be broken. This relationship will never be broken. And then you have a political event that maybe, boy, it sure makes it look like this relationship is broken. How did Jerusalem get destroyed if that relationship is intact? So the entire city, including the temple, which is where God was believed to dwell, was destroyed, and the people were forcibly taken from their homeland and relocated to a place in a foreign nation, thousands of miles from their home. So take a moment to imagine how disorienting that would be for you. So we have this moment of remarkable triumph, and then we have this moment of crushing defeat, right? So we have these two historical moments. So how do you, if you have these two ideas of covenant, and then you have these two historical turning points, like how do you understand your story in light of each of those worldviews, right? Do you have any, like, maybe put yourselves in the shoes of someone who believes in a covenant of obligation or someone who believes in a covenant of grant. How do you make sense of either of those moments? That can be a hypothetical question. So, but let's look at, on the screen here, different responses to these two historical moments. So if you're team obligation, say, and you go through, and like you experience the exodus from Egypt, they say like, yeah, God redeems us from slavery in Egypt to be in relationship with us so that we can keep all of these, so that we can have this covenant relationship, right? And, but if you're team grant, the exodus from Egypt is because of the covenant with Abraham. We go back and back to the promise that was always in place and was never disrupted, and that's why God saved us. So you can kind of see actually in this case that they sort of reinforce one another, right? That you have like a relationship that needed to be, that like held fast, and because of that we are going to hold fast to this relationship, right? So in some ways they find harmony with one another around this historical event. But then when you get to the crushing defeat, the exile, they don't so much find harmony with one another. If you are team obligation and you experience the exile, the Babylonian exile, you might respond in the way that the authors of Leviticus respond, right? You say, we are in exile because we broke the covenant God made with Moses. So they hear all of those curses that were part of that covenant and say like, yeah, obviously this was going to happen. Exile is among those curses that is listed when you sign that agreement, right? So if you will not obey me and do not observe my commandments and you break my covenant, I will scatter you among the nations. You will perish among the nations, and the land of your enemies shall devour you. If you're team grant and you experience the Babylonian exile, you have a different theological response to that, a different religious response to that, which is to say, that relationship with Abraham has to still be valid. That covenant that God made, that promise God made to Abraham has to still be valid. Even though our circumstances don't look much like that right now, don't much seem full of hope or promise, like it just still has to be there. So again, here's another response. Then, you'll remember your covenant with Jacob, with Isaac, and Abraham. I will remember the land. God will remember this relationship. So you have these different, just very different responses, right? Sometimes, and I said sometimes they operate in harmony and sometimes they operate in tension. And so, for me, it's easier to get into the mindset of tension, right? Like, why would these worldviews be so different? And I think it's like I was I was talking with my husband about this week while I was kind of pulling this together. He's also going to be a PhD in Bible very soon, and he said that he thinks of it like the exile is like that Mike Tyson quote where it's like, well, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. right? And then all of a sudden, like all of your plans go out the window and it's, whatever. So, but again, you have like, it's easier for me to get into this like tension between the two when you experience the exile, but at any rate, they end up with entirely different interpretations of this one historical event, because challenging experiences change your theology. So what happens then is that new expressions of covenant theology begin to appear in the Hebrew Bible. So we had these two that we could not make them fit together anymore. And so now we're going to have new expressions of covenant theology. We're going to have to find new ways to make both of these, or to work with both of these different ideas. Can we go to the next slide? So history after the exile is rewritten with it's written with a reframed theology. You see new theological expressions post-exile. So in trying to explain how they could have ended up in that situation, some historians, who were also the theologians of the day, made a new argument that blended the two kinds of covenants, that said both of these are operational at the same time. Well, actually, so here, can we go to the next slide, and then maybe we'll come back to this one. So here we have, here we have a blended version of the two covenants. So this is from 1 Kings 9, and it's when Solomon is becoming king. So after King David has died and Solomon is becoming king, you have history being written in a way that puts these two covenants together. So the purple is the covenant of obligation, and the gold is I just realized that's the Vikings colors. And it did not do that on purpose, but the gold is then the covenant of grant. So you see those two theological positions being put together into the same paragraph here, right? So as for you, if you walk before me, as David your father walked, with integrity and of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you and keeping my statutes and ordinances, then I will establish your throne over Israel forever, as I promised your father David. You can kind of hear, I think, both of those elements, right? So you have this one way of just like, well, they're just both going to be operational. Let's go to the next slide. And then speaking to a community in exile, the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel say, yeah, something's got to give, right, with this way of thinking about our relationship with God. And the problem for Jeremiah, the way that Jeremiah phrases it, the problem is not that, the problem is not that the people are being asked to do something impossible. The problem is people. So we just need a new kind of covenant, one that is inside of us, it's in our hearts. We don't have to teach it and learn it, it's just who we are. So you can see this passage from Jeremiah 31. It might be familiar to you. It's a very famous passage, right? So what Jeremiah is arguing is that we just need a new kind of covenant, right? God says, I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, a covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, says the Lord. In Hebrew there, that word husband is also the just regular word for like Lord, not Lord God, but like Lord. He's making a pun, is my point. So, but this is a covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law within them and I will write it on their hearts. I'll be their God and they will be my people. So, okay, and then let's go to the next slide. Here's Ezekiel saying a very similar thing, right? Talking about a new covenant that will be, he says, I will remove the heart of stone from your body and give you a heart of flesh. So the stone there, referring to the stone tablets of the covenant, right? And we're going to have a covenant of flesh instead. I will put my spirit in you. This will cause you to follow my laws, right? So the change is going to be like interior. It's not a different kind of relationship. It's like the change is in the people. So this is a hopeful vision, I think, for sure. Not only but it puts some, it's like to say that the problem is people and this is still possible is a hopeful vision, right? So, yes?
So the Hebrew theologians, their talk is about this. A lot of this, for me, is about a change in the people. But what about the change in God? God's interaction
Yeah,
with the people of Israel or with us?
right?
Do they ever discuss how it changes God?
Well, so that's a very good question. The question was, if you didn't hear it, the question was, they're talking about a change in people. Do they talk about a change in God ever? And I will say, I think within the span of the Hebrew Bible, yes, I think God is changing, right? And then also the New Testament community is going to make a different kind of argument for how God is changing, how this relationship is changing. Yeah. So, but I think that is also happening in the pages of the Hebrew Bible, right? That in the Old Testament itself, we do see God changing, right? That this relationship is changing because of God, because God has made a choice to be in a different kind of relationship with humanity also. Yeah. Okay. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. So we're going to get to the New Testament now. So for some of the people from this covenant community, the covenant community of Israel and Judah, the events surrounding Jesus' life and death and resurrection come to be understood as another one of those big historical turning points. These people come to be known as Christians, right? But the New Testament is also not of one voice about how we should understand covenant. So I just take a look at some of these texts. I think it's really interesting. Some of these texts might be more familiar than others, but I think it's really interesting that there is also a diversity of opinion about what covenant is and means in the New Testament. So here, the first passages these are kind of like stitched together. This first one is kind of stitched together from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who all report this wording a little bit differently. But this is, at the Last Supper, Jesus is saying something about a covenant, a new covenant, a covenant in blood, right? Like just there's a little, each report is a little bit different, but the cup that is poured out for you is the blood of the new covenant, right? Or poured out for you for the forgiveness of sins. This is familiar language, right? Where do you know this from? Yeah, the words of institution, right? Yeah, you know this from communion in worship, right? Exactly. Okay. And remember that I said also earlier, I said that the Exodus covenant, or that covenants in the Old Testament are also ratified or sealed with blood as well. And I said, remember that because we're going to come back to it, right? So it seems that what's happening is in the New Testament, they are calling back to this image that you know from your tradition, right? That covenants are sealed with blood, sealed with a sacrifice, and sealed with a meal. And all of those things are present then in this encounter with Jesus here. And it also seems that they may have been thinking about the new covenant, the language new covenant that Jeremiah and Ezekiel used. So, next we have passages from Acts and Romans. So you are the descendants and the prophets of the covenant that God gave to your ancestors, right? Saying to Abraham, right? And then the next one from Romans, I have great sorrow in my heart. They are Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, the promise. To them belong the patriarchs, and from them comes the Messiah. So I don't know, I have to say I sort of struggle with some of these texts a little bit. It's hard for me to, this is not my area of expertise, but it's hard for me to hear this and not hear supersessionist approach to covenant. So if you have insights on that, please share them with me. I'm still working at it in my own heart, to be honest. So, but Acts here, says that Peter is telling the Jewish people, Jesus came to you first. because you had the covenant and you had the promises that came with it, and Jesus is the prophet that was promised, the Messiah that was promised. So that's the fulfillment of the old promise. It starts with you and then moves out to the Gentiles and then to the rest of the earth, right? In Romans, Paul says something kind of similar. He says, both Peter and Paul obviously know that Jesus was Jewish. They don't really know what to do with Jewish people who don't accept Jesus as the Messiah. And so they're sort of like working this out. And Paul argues that what happened in Christ is that the distinction between Jew and Gentile is erased. He still identifies as a Jewish man, so, he doesn't fault them. He says that this is part of God's design, that maybe not everybody would believe right away in Jesus' identity as the Messiah. So, I don't know, So Paul works on this a lot. Here's also a passage from Galatians. My point is this: the law, which came 430 years later, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God so as to nullify the promise. So what he's talking about there is, again, like the Ten Commandments, like the giving of the law at Sinai, right? Does not annul a covenant. So, okay, separating covenant promise from the charge to follow the law. I think here, to my mind, it sounds like he's taking the side that a covenant of grant is more important than a covenant of obligation, or is kind of going to take the place of a covenant of obligation. So maybe he's made his argument there. And then the author of Hebrews takes a different approach. So this last passage here. Accordingly, Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. He has obtained a more excellent ministry, and to that degree, he is the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted through better promises. So yikes. But I don't know if anybody can help me with this one, really, with like, oh boy, that's in our Bible, so taking a different approach, right? That's the old covenant. This is new and better, and it totally replaces the old one. So I think in the end, like really where we come down in all of this is that there's a lot going on here in all of these different ways of talking about covenant. So for it to be a unifying theme in your lectionary readings for the year is going to be interesting. What I'm trying to do with all of this is to invite you into this conversation that starts today and is going to continue for the rest of your year together with this lectionary, where the voices don't agree with one another, but where they're really trying hard to like work it out in the context of a faithful community that is faced with a never-ending line of challenging circumstances that push them to rethink what they believe. Like, I think that's the good stuff, right? Like, that's so fun and interesting, and that is what is beautiful about being a member of a faith community to me. So maybe you were hoping for more answers, but I like to have more questions when we're done. So I hope that you have more questions than you have answers. And then I hope that you've also, it's just kind of setting the table a little bit for some conversations that you're going to have around text that you're reading in worship and study this year. And I think that's what I have for you. So please ask questions. Let's have a conversation. And yeah, so.
Dr. Marsh, it strikes me as I sit in here, and I know you're not a church historian.
Yeah.
I suspect those of us who are inheritors of a Reformed tradition, as we Lutherans are, that the distinction between obligation and grant
Sure.
is profound in our own denominational theology.
Yeah.
That in our tradition, we would naturally want to see God as the giver of a gift in covenant.
Right.
Not obligating us, but instead expecting a response, maybe is another
Right.
way to say that, right? And so, for example, I'm sitting here, as you were talking, I was struck about our theology around the sacrament of baptism.
Mm-hmm.
We Lutherans, in particular,
you can do nothing to.
And why we adore infant baptism, because it allows us to say, it doesn't matter if the kid wants to be baptized or not, God does.
Right.
God acts in this moment.
Yep.
So let's celebrate and
Yep.
recognize it, of the gift that is. Now our Baptist brothers
Yeah.
and sisters would say,
You absolutely have to make a
relationship
choice.
that requires an obligation. The believer has to say, I want to be in this relationship with God. And
Yeah.
I'm prepared to live up to the standards that God has put before us. So do you agree in that the theological denominational distinctions, and again, I know you're not a historian.
Yeah.
But
I mean, certainly different Christian denominations, right? Like, have different approaches to this, right? And we'll say, so short answer, I think it's not that Jesus doesn't solve that for us, right? Jesus doesn't solve these distinctions for us necessarily, at least. Like, there are still genuine disagreements about how God is in relationship with humanity after Jesus. For us, for Lutherans, like, we absolutely favor that language of grant, and we absolutely find like a beautiful theological truth in saying, we don't do this. God does this. God chooses us. God gives us, anything that we do that looks like righteousness or looks like the kinds of things that God requires of us, we do out of a response to something that has already been done for us. That's absolutely the way that we would phrase that, but other Christian denominations do not agree with us on that. So, yeah, it's a good question.
And arguably we fought wars over this.
Yeah, right.
We have about 5 minutes
Okay.
or so for some more questions. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a question about, I love the Bible, I love to read it, study it.
Yeah, you and me both.
And I see it, and there's a lot of truth in it, obviously.
Yeah.
For me, the Word of God.
Sure.
But it's also a book of books.
That are really about the development of ideas and theologies about God and our relationship with God. And that God is not static for me in the Bible.
Right.
But that means things develop. And I don't always know how to deal with that or where it's going. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense to me. And I think I would say that after studying the Bible for my entire adult life at like an academic level, that's still an unresolved question for me, right? That like God is still, I think there's still something, there's like a beautiful mystery about the character of God in the Bible. But like I said, absolutely, I think there is development, or there certainly is, whether or not you can draw a straight line through history and say, because I think it's a little more complicated than that. We also have multiple voices that are saying different things over different times. But absolutely, God, the character of God is like we have this, we have this word of God, words of the living God in the Bible, right? But like, at the same time, God is not contained by those words. And so there's just so much more complexity and beauty and mystery that surrounds it. But absolutely, yes, I'm not sure that I'm answering your question, but I'm not sure that there was a question so much as like we just are like, so much as just boy, I have, I read the Bible and it gives me feelings, and like, yeah, me too. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
For me, the whole issue of covenant is what the mystery of the Bible is about from beginning to end. And just that sense of, the covenant is falling apart.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, this,
obligation
right.
and saying, this is the better,
Yeah.
in terms of that, weighing what's more important.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Do I need to repeat the question? The question was kind of, in the end, don't we come down on the side of Grant? And then you read the text from Hebrews that seems like, yeah, it's just coming down on the side of Grant and saying that this older one is kind of like garbage and we don't need it anymore. The problem with that, of course, is that it does not, like, it rejects, like it says, like a lot of what is like revealed in the Bible is just like, nope, don't need it anymore. That's kind of old dusty ideas, and we have these new better ideas, and there's just like some real genuine problems with that kind of approach. But I would say I'm still, like I said, I'm still sort of working on all of this in my own thought, and I wish, like, you know, it was like, oh, maybe if I had another week, I could like come to an answer on it. But I actually think it would take me like years, right? Like it's not about like, oh, if I had a few more days, I could find an answer for this. I'm sure like we've been trying to find an answer, like a particular single answer for this for centuries in the Christian tradition. We've fought wars over it. We've got different denominations about it, and like these are all, you know, how do you reckon with that diversity, right? But I guess like the diversity that is still in the Christian tradition is also the kind of diversity that's in the Bible, where we have like genuine theological differences. I would also say I think it's really easy for us, especially as Lutheran Christians, to hear the language of obligation and hear the language of grant and think, well, that's law and that's gospel, and gospel's good and law's bad. I think there's also like in the way that the covenant of obligation is presented, like God is also making a choice. God is also reaching out to humanity and saying, I choose you, right? And like, here is this gift of law. And it sounds weird to us, but I really do believe that that's what's happening. I think that God also makes a choice in that presentation as well. So there's grace in both, right? There's obligation in both, but like so.
Well, that's like in the Jeremiah or Ezekiel
Yeah.
passages of writing a law in the heart,
Yeah.
so that because God loves us, we're just open to, okay, what do we do, God? How do we love you back? How do we love your world?
Right.
So, yeah, the law changes in cultures and in time and in our growing as human beings, but we still have an obligation to respond to God.
Right, and the way that we would talk about that in our Lutheran tradition would say that it's a response, right? We respond to this gift through all of the things that we do to make the world feel more just and whole, right? So.
Speaking of gift, Dr. Marsh, your presence today has been a real gift among us, and so we are grateful for your contribution to this ongoing theme that we're going to be playing with throughout this year ahead. So thanks for getting us kicked off in earnest in this way, and we look forward to having you back sometime.
Absolutely. So I'll thanks. Next time you have me back, I'll find something we can have some answers on.
Oh, good. All the answers.
There aren't any. Yeah.